welcome everybody to a live stream panel that I'm extremely excited about. As you know, we have a great selection of guests here to speak on a topic that I think is very important and very relevant to our political sphere. Now, we have one guest who's not here currently. Ideally, he will be soon, and we'll let him in once he gets there, by the name of Herb. But I didn't want to keep everyone waiting. So, because some people are very short for time, and we're not one of those rinky-dink 2-bit podcasts that gets started 15 minutes later. We're going to get started on time and ahead of schedule. So, for people who don't know, my name is Dimes. I'm the host of a show called Blood Satellite. I'm not going to give a big preamble about that because everyone who wants to hear from me, right? But I'm going to let everyone here introduce themselves. Most of these people require no introduction, but we're going to give one anyway for those who don't know. So, Steve, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Steve Saylor. I guess I represent baby boomers in this discussion. I'm out promoting my anthology, Noticing, which is available from Passage Publishing. I've been an opinion journalist for the entire century, I guess, going back to the 90s as well. So I'm happy to be here.
Now, the Prudentialist, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew. I'm best known as the Prudentialist on Twitter, YouTube, and Substack. I write about international relations, contemporary culture, as well as social media ecology and how that shapes our politics. Very happy to be here.
Now, John, or actually, let's go with Alaric. Alaric, if you wouldn't mind.
Hello, I write under Alaric the Barbarian, and I'm a history writer, a publisher, and I guess a political commentator now. I've been called that. If you're not familiar, you can find me on Twitter, mostly, also on Substack, and I run the Dissident Review, which is a publishing house.
John, if you would, please.
I am likewise excited to be here. My name is John Doyle. I've been doing political commentary across social media platforms for about 5 years now. And I've given speeches at universities. I've done some consulting. I work with some different right-wing media companies. And so, yes, I'm excited to be here representing Generation Z. As an elder Zoomer, I guess. I'm 24 now. You know, some of these 15, 16-year-olds, I don't know quite so much about what they get into, but should be a good discussion.
Classic Gen Z cope trying to age himself up. Now he's going to tell us he's an old soul next. Now, Herb, great to have you tonight. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Nice to be here.
Now, we're just introducing ourselves. We'll share whatever you would like about yourself and your background.
I'm Herb. I'm a little north of the generation of the, but I have interest in politics. I belong to a number of groups here in Sarasota with whom I interact, and I'm delighted to be here to see how this thing all evolves.
And thank you, everyone, for taking the time, as I had said. So without hemming and hawing too much, we'll just get into it. And I thought I could just set it up from my perspective, what this is all about. And I know everyone has a lot to say, especially John. We spoke at length about this prior, but from my perspective, and when I speak to boomers and I speak to Zoomers and millennials like myself, there seems to be, not only amongst ourselves, but in the discourse, in the news, there seems to be some contentious feelings and some hostility even between the younger generations and the older ones. And both seem to have valid points. The issue is the torch being passed from the elders to the youth. Now, what do we mean by the torch? Well, we mean capital, we mean influence, we mean wealth, we mean all sorts of things. And the examples were given by either side is the younger people will say, we're not being allowed to take the reins of society. We're not being allowed into the upper echelons and being promoted to CEOs. Boomers are holding on to their influence, whereas the boomers will say that, well, these young people, they don't have the values that we like. They're not driven. You'll hear avocado toast brought up a lot. So they just don't see apparent heirs. And what I found in my experience, that it was very rare that either of these sides ever got together to talk. And so without any other real political bias, without any sort of drama in the scene or any priors, I thought this would be a great way to just hopefully inspire some conversations with the viewers and their elders, or to look around and look for opportunities. But I thought we should start by actually trying to understand each other in a way they haven't before. So I was curious if we could go around and just, we'll start with the baby boomers, Steve and also Herb. What is your opinion on, as people who are successful, as people who have influence, as people who are active in their local and maybe even international scenes? What is your view of the younger generations? Are they lacking anything that maybe you might have wanted to see from someone of your age? And we can start with Steve.
Yeah, I'm not big on putting down younger people. My general impression is that the world, the United States, has gotten more crowded and more competitive, and that in many ways makes life tougher for younger people. And I mean, I was thinking, I usually end up going back to baseball, but I was thinking, yeah, you know, how hard did Mickey Mantle work in the off season? What were the heaviest weights he lifted? Well, probably a beer mug. That's about it. You know, did Warren Spahn spend his off seasons throwing weighted balls in order to add 3 miles an hour to his fastball? Nah, he just got out there and threw the same stuff. The baseball was kind of less competitive. Nolan Ryan started lifting weights in 1973 and immediately became a star. And he couldn't convince anybody else on his own team to do what had obviously worked for him for an entire 6 more seasons. You just didn't do that kind of stuff in baseball. That was weird. Now, you know, baseball is hyper competitive and pitchers throw incredibly hard and they get injured and they're constantly going to get operations. They pitch very few innings because when they do, it's so stressful. Everybody, all the batters lift weights, so they're all a danger to hit a home run at any moment. The game is more intense, and you know, it doesn't have kind of as much of the easygoing charm as it used to, partly because people back then, they weren't trying that hard. But now people study how to compete, and there's a bigger population trying to compete. And it makes life tougher in a lot of ways for younger people.
That's a great point. And Herb, same question. What are your feelings on the younger generation?
Well, let me digress a little bit with baseball, because I've got a grandson who's throwing 88, 89, and he's getting up to 91, 92 because he pumps a lot of iron. But my issue is a lack of understanding of what made and makes America great and unique in the history of all humankind. And my complaint is that there is a lack of appreciation of the uniqueness of our situation and a veneration. We have a generation, and I don't know whether it's Z or below Z or whatever the particular number is. You have to forgive me. I'm not as au courant as I might be on this. We believe that this is a corrupt and discriminatory civilization. There has never been anything as enabling as this country in the history of humankind. And yet our young people are taught that this is a horrible place, that we have an original sin of slavery from which we've never moved. And yet the fact of the matter is that there is no place in the world that is more open and welcoming and enabling than this country, and its constitutional structure has ever been.
Fantastic point. I'm very excited to hear what, let's start with Prudentialist. What do you think about all this from your perspective as a Gen Z? Prudentialist, are you there? All right, we'll just go to a John. John, what are your reactions to that?
I think that each of these points are pretty valid. I suppose in terms of the competition, I would only say that my generation, particularly young American men, are not averse to competition. I think the problem is that the product itself is not getting better. I mean, our education is not getting better. Our lawyers and doctors are becoming less competent. And so there seems to be a dynamic where it isn't a matter of how hard we're willing to push ourselves to reach our ceiling for excellence. The scale, as everyone here is aware of, has been tilted to be disadvantageous to young American men, and they're having their opportunities instead given to women, to people of color, to illegal aliens, to whomever. And so there seems to be a dynamic that's constructed. I mean, even we saw recently, what is it, that S&P 100 thing, like 94% of new jobs that were created within those companies in the post-George Floyd era were going to people of color, to women, to whomever. And so I think that it is true that we are more competitive as a society, but young men are being like sidelined. Like we can't even play necessarily. We're more the umpire, as some would say. And then in terms of the history, I think that that's also very true, that even at every stage of your development in this country, I'm sure that there was always a liberal bias in academia or even in the public education system, but the stock of teachers you have now seem to be far less intelligent, far less capable, and school as a whole seems to have transitioned. Even if you look at like, state exams, for example, and there was one that was going around quite a while ago, and it was like an 8th grade exam from the 1910s or something. And I mean, the questions there were very advanced. Fast forward 100 years later, it would seem like child's play compared to what they were learning then. But then I also think that there's something to be said about the type of person who is now teaching our children in these schools. And there may be an attitude of, being ashamed of the country's history because of what they're taught. But I think the demoralization that our generation has as a whole is what leads them to sympathize with those victim narratives. Like, for example, look at the kind of guy who is hitting I think you said your grandson is, or pitching like your grandson is pitching. That's probably like a well-built, handsome young man who's probably not going to be very sympathetic to narratives about his country's history being like horrible or things of that nature. It is when you have these very like almost biologically or spiritually ill stocks of people who are foreign to the nation's history in the first place. I think that those people are the ones who are the most sympathetic to narratives of evil and oppression. I think that if we could get on track the health of the youth, that you would see a lot of that propaganda conditioning sort of melt away naturally because they just wouldn't be susceptible to it.
Amen. I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. My issue is with the fact that our young people in elementary school, never mind high school and college, are being indoctrinated with stuff that I find completely abhorrent.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now, Alaric, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Well, the historical narratives are one thing that I tend to look at a lot. That's one of the main topics I write and think about. And education is obviously very subpar and laced with propaganda right now. But at the same time, you see a falling back of liking American ideals, even with people that are opposed to the propaganda, because they feel like those ideals either never existed or don't exist now. When I speak about Gen Z, people my age, I'm thinking white men my age, not, we can talk about different categories, but I don't have as good of a mental model there. I can just speak from experience and people I know. Everyone feels that everyone else has deranged historical views, and usually they also hold deranged historical views themselves because you're in this matrix of propaganda, counter-propaganda, new narratives, argumentation, and rhetoric. Everyone's been politically active, whether they like it or not, since about age 12. I'm actually a little bit younger than John here, and everyone has been pulled into a political realm and known and understood that they've been pulled into political rhetoric from a very young age, usually around elementary or middle school. So as a result, things are very cynical and argumentative when it comes to self-conception and historical views. That's one thing, and I believe the fix to that is just offering something constructive, like a full vision, rather than just rhetoric and argumentation. But that's a much longer point. I will go back to the competitiveness point with baseball. I thought that was really interesting because this is a generational divide that I think is the source of a lot of misunderstanding. Competitiveness for young people is the same thing as, nowadays at least, specialization. You end up specializing far earlier than people did, I'll say even 30 years ago, 40, 50, 60 years ago. People specialize. You can see this in sports. You'll have kids playing like little league football, and they're already specializing into positions at 7 or 8 years old. They're like, oh, I'm a corner. What? You're 8, and the same thing happens with career paths. You're expected to drive onto a career path very early, and that specificity is a source of great stress for Gen Z. Whether it's necessary or not is a different question, but that's a source of generational stress that people, feel like you have to lay things out very far in advance just to be competitive.
I just to add to that briefly, my grandfather, before he passed, his whole life he worked as a lawyer, and I know that part of becoming a lawyer, at least here where I live in Canada, was taking an LSAT test, and that just didn't exist when he was taking a lawyer, and that LSAT test had filtered out a few of my friends who had dreams of being a lawyer. So that's just one example of, I think, the increased credentialism in certification that's out there just to even get to the level where you can participate. Would that be fair to say?
Oh yeah.
I think those points are are legitimate. I think the specialization among young, and I'm going to talk about boys because boys are more, not exclusively, but more involved in sports. The specialization at early ages is a terrible, terrible thing, but unavoidable in today's environment. I've got 3 grandsons. One's a baseball player, another was a soccer player. Third one hasn't quite declared yet. But the baseball player and the soccer player have been going on their track for much too long, and they've never experienced. You remember, I mean, Steve is old enough. 3 sport athletes doesn't exist anymore. You can't do that. You can't do that, and so that's terribly unfair, I think, to young people today.
Well, that's interesting. 3 sport athletes. If you wouldn't mind just explaining that for a second, what that
Look, I used to be able to play baseball, football, and basketball. You can't do that anymore.
Yep.
Because you have to specialize in one sport earlier in order to be competitive. And if you have real credentials, you got to develop it. I have 2 granddaughters, one of whom's a swimmer, but she's in college and not swimming alone. The other one's a gymnast, which I will tell you is the most demanding of all sports. And God help her. I mean, she goes through what none of us could go through, but she does 4 or 5 hours a day in gymnastics. I mean, think about it. She's a 14, 15-year-old girl. That's her whole life. It's not right, but it is the world that we live in today.
There's a few people in the chat who are getting confused by all the sports metaphors, and there's people my age most likely. Don't worry, as a millennial, I will be making plenty of A24 films references. So, Prudentialist, sorry, you were a bit quiet, but when I asked you before, but I would love to hear your take on this so far.
Yeah, I do think that there was a lot that was said that many others on the panel had sort of, I think, would agree with is that there has been sort of this great divorce from any common ancestry when it comes to history. There's no unified story of what America is anymore, which I think for younger people especially, that leads you to be, as what John had said, forced into political camps very early on based upon who you interact with, where you live, what are the politics of your city, suburb, or small town, and the rest. And it's very hard, I think, for younger Americans, particularly white men, because that's really who I talk to or I associate with these days. And they're automatically thinking that the world is sort of against them in this sense. They don't mind fighting that world. There is still that competitive drive, but there has been this overall feeling that they have a lot more hurdles to clear than what had come before them. And that often, I think, generates a lot of intergenerational animosity. As for competition, I think that most of the guys that I know, and even the younger gentlemen here, I'm 28 years old going on 29, they're very competitive, they're very driven, they're very passionate about what they do, whether that's, maintaining their physical health or learning about how to better themselves or prepare to be a good husband or a good Christian, whatever. It also illustrates, I think, a great struggle when it comes to, how do I hold on to a positive identity when I'm surrounded by politics or an economic situation that feels like it doesn't want to identify with the historical American nation that many who are older than us grew up in or identified with, or perhaps in the eyes of some of the more resentful younger men, taken for granted. And so I think that that's maybe the biggest divide here is that the nation, the way of life that once had, by our older cohorts here, doesn't feel like it's around anymore or has been abjectly taken from them.
Now, the next area of questioning, I thought we could just get right to the meat of it, of course. So, having expressed all this, what does either side, as it were, think that the other could be doing to resolve this issue? Because everyone has their, prejudices. Everyone thinks that they're owed something. Whereas maybe I'm a romantic. Hell, maybe I'm a lib. But I tend to think of us as links in a chain, whereas boomers and the younger generations in the media and in the discourse, they talk of each other like they're different species, or sometimes that they're opposing teams. And that's really what I was trying to address and break down here. But I wanted to start by saying, let's blue sky it. And we'll start with Mr. Saylor. In your mind, having heard everything, is there anything that the younger generations could be doing to help resolve the issue on their end?
Well, let me go back to something I think I first articulated in 1976 when I arrived at college in Texas. I'm a native Californian, and somebody asked me, "Well, what's going to happen in California?" And I said, "Okay, California is basically underpopulated for how nice the weather is, and so people are going to keep pouring in, and it's going to get more expensive all the time till eventually the standard of living, including the beautiful climate, is no better than anywhere else, and then the population will stabilize." Now, when I said that, 38 years ago, that pretty much is what happened. What I wasn't anticipating was that we were going to put that process into hyperdrive by leaving the borders fairly open. And not surprisingly, a large part of the rest of the world wanted to move to California. So over time, people from Ohio and Indiana and so forth have dropped out of thinking about, well, I should move to California, because they know it's really expensive and their standard of living is going to be poor. And that whole process would have happened, but we probably sped it up twice as much by through mass immigration. So that's one obvious thing, is to cut back on immigration and let Americans enjoy a little bit more of the benefits of having this big continent to ourselves, and that we don't have to live, like East Asian tiger mothers and just intensively drill our kids all the time and so forth. So, that's not answering the question of what should the younger generations do, but it's kind of like, if we all get together, we can make life not quite as stressful by just allowing an immense amount of immigration.
Now, Herb, the same question, and I know that you're very active in your political space. You probably deal with young people in a pretty political context. And I'm wondering, based on what you've seen on the ground, what do you think young people could be doing to make it better?
Well, let me pull it back and say that I don't really deal with young people on a political basis. The political discussions and interactions that I have are people of my generation, old fogies, and, worrying about what our grandchildren will inherit going forward. I don't know that there's anything that, the real world has a way of smoothing off the rough edges and introducing you to reality. And the problem with an ivory tower is the whole concept of an ivory tower. You're isolated from the real world. So I don't know. I mean, every generation has always had conflict with the preceding generation or generations. And I'm not sure that there's anything endemic here, other than the fact that a lot of the young people have simply been brainwashed with ideas that I find totally repulsive. I mean, the fact that half of our college graduates think that socialism is as good as capitalism, is to me shocking. And the disrespect for the Constitution, a lack of understanding of how unique our experience is. But I don't know that they won't get there on their own as they get, families and mortgages and deal with the real world. I mean, the real world has a way of imposing itself on a lot of crap.
Now, I'm sure there's probably some thoughts on that. Let's maybe mix it up here. Alaric, we'll go Alaric, then Prudentialist, then John. So, Alaric, what are your thoughts on, from your perspective, could baby boomers be doing anything different? And if you have any general thoughts on what's been said so far.
Well, first of all, Herb mentions a sort of disconnection from the Constitution, from American ideals. This is largely because people, again, younger white men, we'll say late teens to early 20s, have understood that has not applied to them since they've been very young. We've been looking at, disparate impact type policies, DEI and its unnamed ancestors and things like that. Everyone has had the same experience of looking for college scholarships or grants or something like that and going, oh, wow, 90% of these are just for women or Black people or Asian Americans or something like that. At the same time, we also had Me Too occur at a very formative age where you're trying to talk to girls. That's pretty weird. That kind of screwed over young people. Just generally speaking, there's very little belief in these things because we haven't experienced them. There's right or left because the generation's very polarized politically, far more than people, we'll say people 20, 30 years ago even. There's just very little belief in this. And one of the big frustration points of younger people with, we'll say, baby boomers is that they did experience that, and they're coming from a frame of reference where this was a lot more, this was potent. These ideals meant something. And now whenever things like, the American dream or, American exceptionalism are invoked, it sort of, to many people, feels a bit like a joke, just because they haven't experienced it. I don't think I got a large dose of the American dream or American ideal growing up, and it doesn't look like it's alive now, especially with deranged communists in a lot of positions of power. So that's one thing. There's a misunderstanding, I think, of how really deep this hits you when you're raised into it. The other thing is just generally, a lot of people in the chat have mentioned wealth and power transfers and things like that over time. Giving young people responsibility, ability to do things, sort of a long leash to actually work and not be. This mostly applies in politics, I think, and just not wanting to appeal to an older sort of consensus. So yeah, I could go into that longer, but I don't want to hold up too much.
Yeah, so a prudentialist, thoughts on anything you've been hearing? And if anyone else wants to jump in, you don't need to rely on me, conducting everything. If you want to tell me to shut up, I can do that.
I think maybe just by growing up as a military brat, my father was in the Army for quite some time, that, I was given and I was blessed to be raised with the notion of a country, of a flag, of a creed, of a constitution to believe in. And you sort of witnessed at least in my view in growing up, you witnessed that global war on terror, sense of patriotism quickly dissolve into the ether after George W. Bush leaves and the war grows unpopular. But on top of that, it's only compounded by the ongoing differences between America, as Steve had pointed out, as the borders opened up. And I think that there's a lot of talk these days about people feeling aimless, or that the economy isn't really built for them anymore, or that they don't see a reason to keep going. And so you have these things called like deaths of despair, as our colleague of ours, Jeremy Carl, wrote in his book, The Unprotected Class. But I think one of the biggest things about that atomization or this resentment has been just the fundamental transformation of the country over the last 50 years. That America had gone from a place that was seen as this place where the Constitution was enshrined, it was protected, it was defended, it was the civitas of the country, to where now most places you live are very low trust environments, or at least they feel that way. And that despite the fact that, according to an article from Fortune, that as Gen Z is doing well for themselves economically, it's an entirely different social world and environment where inflation is through the roof. We have politics that seem to cater more towards older people than looking towards the next generation. And so there's this big divide between, say, the previous generations and those who are younger who are getting involved in the world, where they feel as if A, they've been left behind, but B, that there is no kind of politics that looks towards their future. Now, Herb mentioned that he was, caring about their grandchildren, and that's a great attitude to have, and I wish more people had it. There's just, for many people, they don't feel as if there's anyone focusing on planting that tree that they're not going to live, see, grow up, and be the shade that their grandkids or great grandkids sit under.
All right. Now, John, we can throw it to you unless someone had a point to make there.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I mean, I'll give my theory. And it sounds pretty partisan, but basically the Democratic Party figured out a generation ago or so that America was becoming more diverse and that they could benefit because as being the party of diversity. And that's worked pretty well for them in the last 8 presidential elections. They've won the popular vote 7 times. So what they've done is they've put together what I call a coalition of the fringes of American society, or Democrats might call it the coalition of the margins of American society. You get the black church ladies, the transgenders, the Hollywood moguls. You get this wide variety, immigrants, and so forth. And there's a lot of them, and you can keep putting together more and more groups. You can encourage people to come up with new diverse identities, like transgenderism over the last 10 years. All right. But there's one problem with it, which is kind of obvious, which is that all these different fringe groups don't really like each other. And what's holding them together? Well, the Democrats have thought about it, and they go, well, the one thing that can hold together our coalition of the marginalized is hating core Americans. So we're going to demonize people who are, the more you're like George Washington or Ben Franklin or John Adams demographically, yeah, you're the bad guy. And everybody else in the country can unite around being mad at you and trying to think of ways to take away your privilege and so forth. And Republicans have generally sort of put up with it. They haven't really called it out. They tend to use kind of euphemisms like socialism, Marxism, critical race theory, and so forth, instead of just going, yeah, we've got a lot of racist anti-white hate that's being promulgated by the Democratic Party and their allies in the media and academia and so forth.
All right. So I think, was the Prudentialist or John who was going to go next, did I say?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect articulation of the impulse that is driving young people to support socialism. I think a lot of times when we analyze Generation Z, we do so assuming that it's demographically the same as prior generations. But Gen Z, I think, is majority non-white or something close to that. I think since 2013, all births in this country have been by majority non-white. And so what is driving that impulse for young people to be sympathetic towards socialism, I think, is because socialism is, as he mentioned, defined in practice by redistributing opportunities and wealth away from white men to women. Because that's the thing about that coalition. It's very popular, for example, with the sort of we'll say boomer conservative messaging, to poke fun at how that coalition can have people out there waving pride flags at a demonstration that is supposed to be about the liberation of Palestine. And they see in that behavior a contradiction. But the Democrats know that what unifies that coalition is ultimately that everybody, be it Palestinians, gay people, trans people, feminists, they all have some bone to pick against white American men. And so that's been very successful for them as a strategy in terms of unifying their coalition. And so what I don't like about that is that I have to be told by a lot of these organizations that socialism is the biggest problem, which, I run a show that is anti-communist. And so I do understand that. But it's like when we're asked, okay, what is the solution to that problem? We're told to go read some century-old economic treatise. And so they almost want to take the messaging that is opposed to socialism, opposed to communism, and use that to fundraise. But then is that money used to actually solve the problem? Is that money then actually used to provide job opportunities to young American men? No, we get things like the Young Women's Leadership Summit, the Young Jewish Leadership Summit, the Young Black Leadership Summit, things like that. So you have all this infrastructure that is collecting money off of what everyone understands what is happening in this country, but then they're not using that money to dispense it to the victims of that. They're using that to instead just do whatever else with it, basically, get black car service, nice hotel rooms for themselves. I mean, it's very good work if you can have it, but I think the problem is that the transformation of the country, which was alluded to, has been presided over by baby boomers. And it seems, not again to indict anybody on this panel in particular at all, but it is to say that there seems to be a lack of communication there. When people in my generation voice those concerns, it is dismissed as, we don't know, we're out of touch, we have to work harder. And I think that there is an inability, largely speaking, to understand just how drastically things have changed for, a guy in his early or mid-20s trying to make something of himself in this country.
Now, I've got a question, and we'll start with Steve and Herb on this. One thing I'm detecting in a lot of these answers is a bit of a divide on, let's call it, faith in the system. And just anecdotally, I remember speaking to my grandmother at one point. She watches the news. All baby boomers watch the news, so they know kind of what's going on out there. And I remember she was commenting on the housing market, and she was kind of shaking her head. Up here in Canada, I don't know how many Canadians are watching, but it's abysmal up here if you want to own a house. Won't go into that, but she was kind of shaking her head saying, I don't know how young people are ever going to be able to afford a home. But I detected when both sides are kind of saying the same thing. With young people, they blame the system. The system is broken and maybe it can't even be fixed. But I did detect with my grandmother and people of her generation, there's still some faith in the system. And even for someone like Steve Saylor, who is so ingrained in this sector of the further right, I was wondering, do you still maintain a belief in the system? Has that changed perhaps over the past 10 years versus when you were younger? And what are your feelings towards, by the system, I mean the government and the interplay between that and the culture and academia and everything?
Yeah, I mean, clearly starting about 2013, after Obama's reelection, we had the Great Awakening, a real intensification of kind of the looting of traditional America. I suspect, I predicted in 2008 that Obama's first term in office would be pretty moderate and cautious because he wanted to get reelected and didn't want to, scare what was still a white majority. And then kind of the gloves came off with the second term, whether that was particularly Obama's plan or he just sort of let his people kind of run amok. But yeah, you just had an enormous increase in the racist, sexist attacks in the media on men and white men, and basically white men were too much of too gentlemanly to like call it out for what it was, racism. So you're seeing over the last year or so, the people speaking out more and not being scared to admit that that the dominant conventional wisdom of the establishment is sexist and racist against white men.
Now Herb, the same question. Just the same question.
Well, basically, social movements are pendulums. They swing from one extreme to the other. And the question that we have to face at this time is whether we've reached an extreme and started to swing back again. And whether, in fact, the unique American psyche, and remember, all of us, whether it's 2 generations or 3 generations or 4 generations, are the progeny of people who left something to find something better. And there is a unique American attitude. And I would go so far as to say that probably 90% of the people coming over the southern border, though I think it should be stopped, and they're no different from any of our grandparents or great parents. They just want a better life, and they're willing to take a chance. So do we have enough strength to reject the bureaucracy and the government intrusion, which has basically, really, you can start it with the New Deal, and it reached its peak probably under Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, which destroyed the black family and had a host of other sociological implications that were very detrimental to the country. Are we going to come back again? I don't know the answer to that. Sometimes I talk to young people and I say, gee, they're really going to find the answer to this. And sometimes I talk to them and say, gee, they don't have a clue what's going on. So I don't know the answer. But my hope is that, as with all societal movements, they reach an extreme and then they come back. And whether we're starting to see that, we are seeing the rejection of DEI and CRT in schools and in corporations more significantly. This next election, it seems to me, is extraordinary in what it means for the country. And what's just happened, I don't know whether we're supposed to go to political things at this point or not, but I will, because I don't mind throwing a bomb here and there to have people respond. This tragedy of lawfare is so detrimental to the country, broadly speaking, never mind Trump or anybody else. The fact that we are now behaving like a banana republic is totally terrifying to me. He's the one who's going to eliminate norms, and yet here we have something that we've never seen before. Hopefully the pendulum swings back and we're going to start to move back toward the center. We've gone to the extreme. Maybe we come back.
I had another question there. Someone made a good point about Zoomers. It's kind of hard for me as a millennial to get a read on Zoomers, and maybe the Zoomers can clarify, because for years I was hearing that they're going to be the most based, they're going to be the most conservative, far right, everything, and then every couple of years it would switch the other way. That they're actually the most neurodiverse and gender diverse. So I can never get a read.
Could I interrupt just to ask a favor? When you bring up these generational titles, can you mention how old these people are? Because I can never remember.
Good point. So that would probably be a good place to start, actually. So what? Because I know
Zoomers.
Yeah, how old are Zoomers? Right? What's the age range for there? Because there's also Gen Alpha that's kind of getting older now too.
There is.
Yeah. So let's say, hey, John Doyle and Alaric, what would you classify as a Zoomer? Because there's like older Zoomers and younger Zoomers. What would you say it is?
I think officially it's like maybe 97 to 2015. But in my personal study, I like to draw a line right around 9/11. And I think that the sort of second wave Zoomers, so to speak, experienced a much different upbringing because of the integration of technology into their day-to-day, as opposed to maybe myself and Alaric, who had it more ornamented in our day-to-day, but it was not something that we were dependent on. But I believe officially, if you looked it up, it'd be like 1997 to 2012, 2015, somewhere around there.
Yeah, so like even for me, a millennial, like we complain about ourselves all the time. We're weird. We're like existentially anchored to rap rock, So I'm wondering, with the Zoomers, what are your feelings on the Zoomers? Are you optimistic about your own ability to maybe succeed in the future? And this will dovetail to our next question, but are you optimistic about, let's say, the genetic stock that you're surrounded with?
In a certain sense, so I think it is true that the people who are our guys are definitely better politically than in previous generations, probably just because they had to grow up a little bit faster in that regard. But overwhelmingly, I don't think that we are this sort of like force for American conservatism. The way I remember that article came out in like 2016 or something, what is it, like Gen Z is the most conservative generation since World War II. I don't think that that's accurate, but I think it is true that in terms of people who are in our generation who do believe in conservatism, I think that they are much better on the issues, so to speak, than would have been the case maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I'm optimistic on the basis of that. I'm also optimistic because I think there is something to be said about historically, when you've got people who should be able to sort of naturally ascend into the upper class, who are no longer able to do so because of credentialism, because of this sort of nepotism against them, for whatever reason. I think that those people start to sort of network with each other and know each other and can assemble a sort of counter elite, so to speak, which would be ready to take up reins in the event of some mass immiseration scenario, which I think is probably likely within the next 20 years or so. Which is, you saw this, for example, recently with like the frat boys all across the college campuses, and you had an impulse on the far right to demonize these guys and counter signal them and claim that everybody who was out there was doing it because they're all Zionist shills, whether or not they're aware of that. And it was sort of like this ridiculous scenario, because those are the guys, healthy, young, handsome, educated, white men. These are the guys who are going to be working for us in based world. These are the guys who we need on our side. And everybody does have that sort of entry level where they realize really what's going on in the world, some of us sooner than others. But for those young men, that was probably a very awakening moment where maybe they grew up in neighborhoods which weren't exactly enriched. They go to college and all of a sudden they're being told all of these horrible things in their classrooms. They literally cannot walk to their classrooms because they are being blocked by these like just disgusting orc-like humans who are telling them that they're going to destroy the entire country, basically just to spite them. And so I would say I'm optimistic, just because at the end of the day, there are tens of millions of us. We're not going anywhere. And typically what tends to happen is when our stock decides it's time for something to happen, that's usually when it does tend to happen. And so I don't think that we should be pessimistic. I don't think that we should be black-pilled. I think that everything it's going to be very bad for quite some time, but ultimately I think that we'll prevail.
Now, Alaric and then the Prudentialists, I'd be curious here what you think, like looking around, and I believe Alaric, you'd be the youngest one on the panel. What do you see where you're standing with your cohorts?
Well, you said that the perception swings between the most neurodiverse and, gay and whatnot, and the most conservative or like Nazi-like generation. They're both true. They're simultaneously true. Again, you look at young white men, you're largely going to see right-leaning views. You look at young women overall, you're going to see left-leaning views. In general, though, it's very polarized. There are, no one's like apolitical or doesn't care. People will sort of put up a front of that, but realistically, there's two teams and they're increasingly diverging, and they have very strong visual effects on people. If you're a younger guy and you have normal ideas about the world, at this point, you're probably lifting and, social and you just look like a normal person. At the same time, there's a sort of dissent for the people who, pick up left-wing ideals, and they're the stereotype. They have, awful hair dye and imagined mental disorders and things like that. So both are true at the same time. But generally speaking, the younger frustration with, we'll say, older leadership comes from the fact that older leadership generally doesn't want to recognize the reality of the situation in a political sense. Like young, white guys my age, you see things like feminist or female power coming from the right. You see like these, young women's leadership conferences like John brought up. And it all feels like part of the same thing, just an earlier ratchet in the movement. So the disassociation with the, we'll say, like mainstream right or things like that is there because it feels like all one thing. It's just, everything's, usually you'll hear like, everything's kind of gay, everything's kind of stupid. And besides that, everyone my age, at least, I would think, sort of realized that 75% of what they're doing at any given moment is just fake in 2020. The entire world was picked apart with COVID, and the lifestyle changes were drastic and nonsensical and really absurd. It sort of felt like a Kafka story for 2 years. And that's had a big effect as well. It's like, okay, these things don't matter. Things like, we'll say bureaucratic norms are just foreign because why do you care? That's the general attitude. I'm not saying that's a good view to necessarily have, but that is the attitude because so many of these things clearly didn't matter for 2 years and the entire country didn't burn down.
And Prudentialist, I haven't spoken to you in a little bit. Just same question. What are your feelings on Gen Z where you're sitting?
Well, it's always difficult, I think, to sometimes ask for one generation and then we're kind of ignoring, say, Gen X or the millennials. I mean, I think that Gen Z is coming out from the overshadow of, say, millennial culture. I think that people will say millennials get blamed. There's some articles from the mainstream press over the last 15 years that say the millennial generation is killing X product or X service. And at the same time, that also will include the younger Zoomers that are now coming of age and participating in education and the economy. But I mean, this is generations that have grown up in the midst of the Obama administration as either their childhood or their formative years. So witnessing, Barack Obama did promise that he would fundamentally transform the country, and I think he has. And he's probably one of the most consequential presidents in modern American history that I don't think gets enough attention now that he's out of office. But I think that for Gen Z, I think what Alaric said is absolutely true. They are simultaneously, depending upon their racial background, where they were raised or what they grew up with, they are either militantly conservative or they are militantly a progressive liberal activist. As for participating in the future, I think that one of the things that has to be considered is that there is no real public square anymore. There isn't the civic ideal of Mr. Smith goes to Washington, because Mr. Smith can nowadays just tweet at his local representative or even the airline customer service line on Twitter and get an answer way more effectively and quickly than, say, the bureaucratic process, which doesn't get respected. And as someone who works in government, I find it rather strange that there's so much political illiteracy for as much political anger and vitriol there is either towards previous generations or just in general, because a lot of our problems, while they do come and stem from Washington, they also can be fixed at a rather local level. And most people do not take the time to yell at their county commissioner or to meet their city councilman over issues that can be fixed at a relatively local area or level where they are. At least when it comes to, say, the suburbs or smaller towns. For big cities, I know that can be a huge hurdle and a mess. But we don't take advantage of the real world connections as much as we do online, because I think for many people, Gen Z especially, that's the only place that you can really exist with your ideas or to vent your frustrations. Because if you try and engage in real life, as John had said, if you're on a college campus, good luck expressing anything that's to the right of Chairman Mao, because you just will be shouted down, bureaucratically harassed, or be labeled as an extremist by the Student Grievance Center, and your risk of getting kicked out of college is very real.
Those are fantastic points. And you mentioned something there I just wanted to just underscore, which is that there was some news I'd read one time, same thing that happens to all of us. You see a screenshot come across your desk and you immediately believe it. And then sometimes you actually look it up to see if it's real. The screenshot that I read was that, baby boomers represent the majority of new homeowners in America. And I actually looked it up and it's not true. It's millennials that are kind of just, they're still there, the boomers, but the millennials are still number one right now. And I think we are seeing a transition in the mainstream news, looking at millennials as the financial driver right now. Like, you're starting to see more shows. The very fact that we have so much true crime horse shit out there is pretty much driven by millennial women. So almost the entirety of Netflix right now is built around millennial women. That's relevant. But you're starting to see that shift, and maybe that shifts away from boomers eventually into millennials holding the hot potato. But I just wanted to maybe segue into the next question, which is, and we can speculate on this all we want. And I know baby boomers right now, maybe those on the panel, and most of the time elsewhere, even if they're not connected that politically, they are right about now seriously thinking about their legacy, what they're going to leave behind. So they are oftentimes looking towards their grandchildren. And I wonder, and we can start with the older representatives here, if things continue the way they're going. Let's say, and I'll give an example. There's a lot of news. A good friend of mine, Sean Weiland, in the chat, who's a financial advisor, he tipped me to this, that there's some serious issues with Social Security that are probably going to become apparent around 2030, which might very well decrease the amount of monthly payments that go out. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to collapse. However, maybe baby boomers are the last generation that experienced this thing called retirement at 60. And maybe the seeds of that have been planted in younger people. Speaking for myself, my generation, we don't really think about retirement that much. Forget job security. We don't think about retirement as the same certainty as I think others do. And I would assume it's the same with Gen Z. So I'm wondering if current trends persist, have you looked ahead into the next 10 years, 15 years? What do you think, where do you think that might lead us?
Well, you can see it on college faculties. Back in the 90s, Congress passed the law, I believe, pretty much outlawing mandatory retirement for college professors. And I'm just amazed these days by the number of octogenarian professors who still have really good jobs at really good colleges and have no intention of retiring at all. And of course, that means that, it's practically impossible for a younger, a PhD candidate to get hired on any kind of non-adjunct position. So people, at least in most of the world, not so much the United States in the last few years, but that's probably more murders and traffic accidents, are living longer, and you can kind of get fixed up enough to do a half-assed job. And so people with nice jobs are tending to stay in these nice jobs, and they're not getting out of the way it was expected they would at age 65.
And Herb, same question. Let's just, and we can speculate as much as we want here. From where you're standing, the next 10 to 15 years, if things persist, where do you think America might end up?
I really don't have any comfortable idea. My own perspective is that we are beset by too much government intervention. We have a deficit that continues to grow. But my concern has always been the government intervening in our lives, and we've just accepted it. We have a permanent bureaucracy in Washington that basically runs things. And so what? Every 4 years you change it and nobody cares because they're there and they're not going anywhere. And they are unelected bureaucrats. And if you understand anything about bureaucracy exists to perpetuate itself. On the other hand, this is a great country with a great deal of freedom. And who would have ever thought? I mean, none of us can live without the phone. It's 20 years old. I mean, think of what has happened. I don't know where AI is going to take us. I don't know where all the technology is going to take us. And I don't know how deeply ingrained the American ethos is in terms of being independent and wanting to do things for themselves. It's a unique characteristic that defines all of America. And I don't know where that's going to play out. If it plays out normally, if it's given a chance to express itself, we'll be fine. Because there is nothing in my mind stronger than the ability of free men to figure out what's going on in the world.
And Herb, just to maybe develop that a little bit, let's say that these values that you believe are so important are not present because they're not as present in millennials. I would argue less in Zoomers, and the subsequent generation maybe even less. Do you see, I know you're not a fan of socialism. Would America become more socialist, more open borders?
No,
things like that?
just learn to speak Chinese.
Now we can throw it to the younger gents here. Now let's start. Actually, let's start with you, Alaric. What are your thoughts? Let's say 10 years, 15 years, current trends continue. Where do you see things going?
Well, for one, I see that American exceptional ideal sort of fading out of relevance completely. I don't think it's a good thing, but I see it happening. I can't speak to the economics of things just because, like Herb said, it's very unpredictable with where tech goes and where the financial markets go. I'm not an expert on that sort of thing, but I can talk about the cultural directions. And I can say that younger people, the younger you go, the less there is a belief in building wealth in a normal way. The less you see a belief in getting a good job and then a retirement plan and things like that, retirement at 60. Most people feel at least that some kind of gradual collapse or descent is imminent and that we are in the looting the treasury stage. Most people can't articulate it that way. Most young people, by that I mean, but that's sort of their revealed preference, I guess, ideologically. They feel like it's time to secure your foothold, and that's not done via traditional means. That's one very common idea. At the same time, people, young white guys and people on the right see patronage politics as the sort of crux of what's going on with the left. It's every job is just, like you're a diversity hire or an ideological hire or something like that. Again, I'm not saying this is the case for every single job in America. I'm just saying this is the perception of what's rising. And generally speaking, it goes for everybody but us. And a lot of the practical economic and just general legislative ideas coming up are give us our slice of the pie. That's a very common sort of feeling. Just that, the looting the treasury thing, I think, is a really potent generational divide because it feels real the younger you go. Again, I don't know if that's true, but
No.
that's definitely one thing that I feel on it.
Well, Alaric, you mentioned something very interesting there. I just wanted to maybe underscore this as well, about the talk of collapse. Now, if you're in our political spaces, everyone's talking about it, dreaming of collapse, really excited about the next apocalypse, of course. But I read this really fascinating book called Decadence by Jim Haugen. Some people are probably sick of me talking about that, but I ain't going to stop. It's a book by a journalist about the 1960s counterculture, which I believe truly was the baby boomers' culture at its core. And one thing he had mentioned in there was the boomers, and I'd be curious to hear from the baby boomers here whether this is true, but there is this idea in the counterculture that the next great paradigm shift was not only on the horizon, but it was their job to usher society into that. And the counterculture that he was describing, people think of the counterculture as a leftist thing, and it kind of wasn't. It was a conflagration of a bunch of different disassociated things kind of being grouped together that was hijacked by the left later. But the idea was that as opposed to the beat generation that came before it, where they were kind of very dour and nihilistic and saw the end coming, the end is always coming. The baby boomers saw it as a bit more positive, that there's an exciting paradigm shift and maybe an exciting collapse coming down the road. And my sense was that never really left us. And I don't know if that's a distinctly American thing, but it sounds like it could be a distinctly Western thing. And I'm just curious about, how do you feel about that? When you were young, were people talking about collapse? Of course, there was the threat of nuclear war and everything, but was there a vibe back then that society was on the downturn? What do you think?
Oh, people always enjoy apocalyptic fantasies. It's hard to project into the future and just imagine how can things carry on anymore, and yet generally they do. They just kind of keep bumping along. I think part of the baby boom experience was, especially if you were an early baby boomer, like from the 40s or born during World War II, the world was kind of your oyster because there had been so few people born between 1930, the Depression, and World War II, that society and the economy really needed a whole bunch of young people to get good jobs and step up and fill in this missing population. And so what we've seen is we've got 4 presidents born in the 1940s, 3 of them born in 1946, the first year of the baby boom. We don't have any born in the 1950s because that part of the baby boom, there was a whole lot of people around, and the opportunities weren't as outstanding as they were in the 40s. So yeah, there was kind of the late 60s as somewhat apocalyptic, but it was kind of a blast. Life was cheap. Young people could drop out for a while, then get good jobs. There were fewer worries, but check out Tom Wolfe articles from the late 1960s is probably a really good source on kind of the economic optimism of the time. All right.
Yeah. Now, Herb, same question. Do you remember these sorts of collapse narratives or vibes back when you were younger?
No, not really. You're talking about the post-war expansion and all of the growth that occurred. Yeah, we had a couple of terrible recessions. We had a stock market that was cut in half. We had the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. We had the hippies, but basically it was a big growth period of time. I mean, it was, I think for the reasons mentioned, the population numbers, and also the fact that it was a post-war growth and there was just tremendous energy. I think it was a time of great optimism. And I would also add the civil rights movement. I think there were some great things going on in terms of improving the society and in reaching our potential. Make love, not war. That's not a terrible way to look at the world, is it?
All right, so back to the original question. I think I only touched on Alaric there. So John and Prudentialist. Prudentialist, let's start with you. Where do you see things going in the next little while?
Well, as I've said elsewhere, I think that it is entirely dependent on one's political eschatology. I think that everyone will look at the news and react to things differently. And so I think everyone's in their various camps. Some people act like Millerites, where they say that this is the exact date, the exact time where everything is going to go down in heck in a handbasket. And there are others that will always say, well, nothing really ever happens. No man knoweth the hour type deal. And I think that really does come as people can measure a sort of decline in quality of material conditions, and also the increase in DEI towards some of the most important high-skilled jobs that you need. For instance, earlier this year, there was the announcement from the FAA that they were going to look and expand towards hiring diverse and neurodiverse peoples for air traffic controllers. Now, this is one of the few jobs that doesn't require a college degree, but it has insane amounts of aptitude tests. And now we're saying that we're going to try and hire people that don't really belong. And I think that definitely contributes to people's concerns in the same way that many have thought that the sky is going to be falling, both due to Boeing aircrafts and potentially just due to non-white and diverse pilots. So we'll see how the Chicken Littles of the world go around. But one of the things that will definitely, I see, continue is that the United States will continue to fracture along sort of these socioeconomic and, more importantly, these ethnic divisions as America's cities and sort of the hinterlands get more and more stratified on what kind of jobs are out there and what kind of communities that people form. And so I think, as John and Alaric had pointed out, that if you're a younger white guy, especially Gen Z or Gen Alpha, you're already built in and born with this sort of political attitude. Because the narrative and the coalition, as Steve has outlined here, and I think it is VDEAR conference speech, not this year, but last year, that really you are sort of persona non grata in the public discourse. So as long as that continues, then that will be the case. And as we've seen in other countries that had ruling majorities or ruling classes of a particular ethnicity, and as they fade away, it doesn't really matter how long the Democrats or, say, the ANC have been in charge. They're still going to blame the minority or the former guys in power and never take responsibility for themselves because they just physically and mentally can't. So I think I
think we'll hear the term legacy majority more and more as whites fade out from being a majority, like they have in California and Texas. But they'll still make a good punching bag.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's definitely correct. The same way that we are made to apologize for the supposed sins of our ancestors, we will then have to apologize for having occupied the government for so long, or for holding all the real estate or all the wealth, and more of that will be transferred from us to the masses of new Americans. And I think that some people will be able to escape from that. You may have a Brazil-like system, or really any third world country-like system, where if you are wealthy enough, then you can live away from the consequences of what has happened. And you can have a gated community. Maybe we'll even have themed gated communities in America. Imagine like the Disney theme parks. You can go live in like a Midwestern colonial. You can go live in like a New England Cape Cod or something, and they'll be like lined up, and people are like, wow, this is what America used to be like. And you'll have these sort of things going on, but the middle class of white people will be totally left behind. I mean, it'll be more expensive for them to live their lives, but they're also, in return for working harder and trying to earn money, that they are able to purchase a lower material standard of living, a lower general quality of life, a deteriorated social fabric, which is now completely hostile to them to the extent that it's not already. So things are going to be very bad. And unfortunately, it's not, I don't think, going to be a situation where like they win and now all of a sudden we can just sort of all come together and be the rainbow country. I think that the vector is going to continue, and they're going to say, well, we still have not achieved total equity, and so it must just be that we have not implemented this extremely enough, and they will continue to persecute old stock Americans, heritage Americans, until maybe then a collapse is possible because the government will have become so incompetent. But in the meantime, I think that we have enough human capital and enough wealth in this country to trudge along for at least another couple decades, I think, before you see something like, a collapse actually occur. But I think we can also reverse that. Depending on who you speak to, collapse was inevitable after 2020 or after 2008 or after the French Revolution or whatever. People want to draw a line in the sand, but I think that we can actually make things better, and we can maybe delay the ceiling, even if we're due for a ceiling, at least for my generation and for the next generation, because we do still have people, we do still have time to work with before these things, I think, reach a point where there are no off-ramps left for us.
Well,
Yeah,
do
you mind if I jump in real quick?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Just to make this clear, when I talk about collapse and this feeling of collapse and looting the treasury, I don't mean like civil conflict and, just going back to the Stone Age or something like that. I mean what John's describing. I mean favela world. That's what is going to happen on the current track, flat out. Whites persecuted into a complete underclass. American ideals long gone, but still invoked to further persecute that white minority. Things like that. Just generally, the outlook is that whatever America was from, we'll say, like post-Civil War to post-World War II, that is ending or already ended, and whatever comes next is necessarily going to be radical one way or the other. Either we're going to have favela world, or we're going to repeal the Civil Rights Act, which is necessarily an extremely right-wing government thing to do. Just wanted to clarify. I'm not like a collapse doomer.
Well, no, but I look at that, and I have spoken to a few people in our scene, guys who have way more financial sense than I do. And one thing that they always talk about is a lot of young people desire investment or the passing on of wealth to them, but they don't seem to have any solid projects or solid organizations with which to absorb that capital and to scale. And that sounds like something I think that could be attractive to boomers from the young people, which is maintaining the civilization itself. And one thing that springs to mind is, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the book Bowling Alone, pretty popular in our spaces, but I read it quite some time ago. But one thing that always stood out to me was the part on civic organizations, about how the baby boomers were way more interested in civic organizations that were local. Right. And these were the bowling leagues was one example, but it could be, Rotary clubs. It could be chambers of commerce. It could be there's dozens and dozens of groups probably in your area that are almost exclusively staffed by baby boomers right now. There's no young interest in it. And there's a lot of money bound up in these organizations, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in carrying it on. And these organizations are at risk of dying completely. So I think there is some interest, and correct me if I'm wrong, from the baby boomers to actually pick up the torch on that level. And from my experience, young people just don't have an interest in those, or they don't like doing things locally. And that was kind of what was argued in the book, which is that you actually do see young people joining organizations, but they are more national or even international focused organizations. They're the opposite of local. They're trying to project into the rest of the world. And so, but no one is looking inward. And Prudential, as you mentioned earlier about, municipal politics and whatnot, but I think there might be some opportunity there. And I'm curious, maybe we start with the two elders here. is that what you experienced growing up? Was there more of a proliferation of people joining clubs and joining local organizations? Has that gone down? And just your thoughts on that.
I mean, the country has tolerated the persecution of the Boy Scouts by plaintiffs' attorneys. We've seen, even though what all these lawsuits were about was quite different from the Catholic Church sexual abuse cases, where the bishops were moving around the bad actor priests. The Boy Scouts nationally were trying to find perverts and put them on a list and never let them join volunteer ever again. But both organizations have been pretty much ruined financially by that, and these the loss of large organizations like that can provide a socialization for large numbers of people. It's hard to that's hard to fill that gap.
Now, Herb, I'm curious to hear from you. Is that appraisal of the situation true? And have you seen anything on your end about people maybe in your political spaces who are complaining that they don't have any interest from younger people, or they have difficulty maybe even interfacing with them rather?
I think that different age groups have different priorities. I mean, I don't want to speak for the younger folks because I don't really understand, their situation, but the whole social dynamic has changed dramatically. Organizations were formed to meet certain needs, and what's happened probably since the New Deal is that lots of the social organizations, whether it was churches or men's clubs or these kinds of things that had a great sense of community responsibility, have been usurped by the government. And so those organizations don't exist so much. On the other hand, I'm here in Sarasota, and I got to tell you that the number of organizations, whether they be art or social or what have you, just have tons of people volunteering and giving money and trying to do good things. I think everybody's in a different stage. I mean, the younger folks are busy developing careers and raising their kids. And I think the nature in which parents interact with their children has changed a great deal too. I think they're much more involved on a day-to-day basis. And I think that takes away something from the community, but maybe works out better for the kids themselves. I don't know. The younger folks would be better able to address the question of what they want in terms of organizations than I would be in terms of what I see in the older organizations, because the older organizations are vibrant. I mean, people are committed to community, work very, very hard, give money and time, and are basically motivated to do things for the community, to make things better.
Now, just a note to the chat. I don't want to see all this shortwave radio discussion going on. Anyone who's talking about their ham radios in the chat, I'm going to find you and I'm going to take the bones right out of your body. Now, from the perspective of the younger people here, I'm wondering, are you engaged in any sort of local civic organizations, anything municipal, anything regional even? And for the people that you're surrounded with, is there just a general disinterest in that? Or perhaps they even see these organizations, as Herb has implied, as just thematically different than what they're looking for? We maybe start the prudentialist first.
Sure, and I think that the civic participation part's a really good question because many people don't feel, and maybe this is just by the nature of how we look at politics these days, or better yet, they just feel as if there's no place for them to get started, is that a lot of people don't participate in civic or local organizations. I feel kind of like an odd man out, or sometimes they quote unquote spiritual boomer, no offense. And that like I still enjoy things like going to community clubs or going to local festivals that are hosted by my town, or going to an orchestra kind of showing type deal, going to a concert like that, because younger people aren't particularly involved unless their family is involved, especially with things, say, like Elks Lodges or other groups like that. Scouting, as Steve had pointed out, has just been so utterly destroyed. I mean, I still carry my Eagle Scout card in my wallet and it's on my resume, but I feel like it's a relic of an older vanished time, as scouting has been so gutted to its institutional core. It's no longer the Boy Scouts of America, it's Scouting America. And again, I think that for many people, it's that they don't feel as if those things are built for them. But on the other hand, I would see a very valid criticism that many young people don't participate unless I think they care, because they feel like it's a progressive cause. I work in the nonprofit governmental background. I won't go too far into it because I don't want to dox myself. But I've noticed that, one of the things that nonprofits and charities have been really focusing on, and they focus on millennials more so than Gen Z, is about experiences. They want these people to help them in their cause, and they need to make them feel like they're part of it, that they're doing something good, that they get something out of it for themselves. What's the me factor? Why should I care? What's in it for me? Which is a totally different way to look at charity, especially within, say, the older Christian religious context, that you gave alms and you did charity works. That's what you were supposed to do, not because you want to feel good about it or take a selfie about you helping an old man. I think that Mr. Beast style of social capital and charity phenomena has certainly done a great deal of damage to younger people. But also, I think the big reason why they don't participate is according to an Experian survey with Experian credit reporting in 2023, more than 3/4 of millennials and Gen Z self-report that they are somewhat or very dependent on their parents for money. And it's very hard to be like a participating member of society if you're still dependent or reliant on intergenerational or family dollars to live a life. I mean, if you're dependent on somebody else and you're not your own person, it feels very hard to have a reason to date or a reason to go out and participate, especially if you're dependent on someone else for money. And so I think that you have a mix of people don't feel the need to care. They feel locked out economically, or greater yet, most of them have checked out of the system. Whereas I feel like an oddity or an odd man out, because I'll be one of the few people under 30 going to city government meetings or going to local, volunteer fire departments and seeing, going to their fundraisers, because I depend on a VFD where I live. And I know that puts me in an isolated geographic position, but maybe those who live closer to the cities might have more to say on this than I do.
Yeah, for the other two younger people here, feel free to jump in anytime. All right.
I was going to give it to
say-
him, but I think it sounded like he was away and he had to glide over in the chair.
Yeah, sorry about that. But no, what's it called? With the organizations, a lot of the frustration comes from the fact that they're often bureaucratically beholden to some kind of left-wing thing, and everything's sort of politicized by default. This is more of a criticism of national organizations with local chapters. Like, for example, a lot of people in the chat have mentioned fraternities. I was in a fraternity. It's a great thing. I really recommend it. But, these are not what they were even 10 years ago, much less 20 or 30. And other local organizations that I've been involved with have often fallen into this weird thing of where you're kind of fearful of just doing your thing without paying progressive fealty. That's an issue, that I personally have, but I don't think it's by any means the main issue. The main issue is definitely what Prudentialist was bringing up with the economics of it. It's just people are poor.
I think there's also, for a lot of people, not an obvious transition when you become an adult. Like you can get involved in Boy Scouts or high school athletics, and then you go to college and maybe you don't have friends there, so you join clubs that are at the school or you join a frat. But once you get out of college, I think it's tough for people to, especially young men, to naturally find friends, because men don't usually just become friends because we, meet each other at the subway or something. It's usually centered around an activity. And a lot of guys just, like was said, don't have the money, or they just don't even have the interest. They just have checked out. They don't have hobbies, because I think a lot of what drives young men to pursue different hobbies and interests is because they're trying to get the attention of young women. And because of technology, because of the way, and Alaric actually has a really great thread on this, the way that the male sexual impulse is policed nowadays by women has made it so guys are either not engaging or interested in that at all. Maybe they're just literally homosexual, or the ways that they're allowed to because of Me Too and these other bureaucratic organizations are ways that are very like emasculating. And so maybe starting a garage band, or even just going out with your friends on a Friday, Saturday, a lot of guys just don't even do that anymore. You know, if they hang out, they'll hang out at home, they'll play video games. Maybe they're doing so online with other guys. But the places I see those sort of communities forming with younger men, independently of some larger island like a university or something, is at gyms, fighting gyms, even honestly different coffee shops, or like sort of co-working spaces, which I frequent sometimes because I am self-employed and I can work remote. I've got the laptop job and everything. But there doesn't seem to be an interest in forming anything that is trying to take itself more seriously than that, which I think is because my generation is very cynical, maybe even more so than Gen X. Like, it's all okay when you're doing it online, or you're not putting a label on it, so to speak. But if you try to start an organization for something, people almost tend to wince at that unless it's aligned with some explicitly or even implicitly progressive cause.
Yeah, and one thing you'll notice is that as our culture has become more explicitly, overtly anti-male, that it sure hasn't made young women happier. It's almost as if young women feel best when the culture encourages male assertiveness and admiration of young men. So we have a society that puts down young men, and women, young women, are having the worst psychological health that's ever been recorded, according to psychologist Jean Twing right now. And I think it's totally connected.
All right. I just want to let people know we got well over 1,200 live viewers watching right now. So hope people are enjoying this. We're coming up to an hour and a half shortly. And I put that as a hard exit for anyone that needs to take it. I'm trying to be very, very conscious of everyone's time, but we actually could technically keep this going for as long as we want. So, but anyone who feels that they need to go, feel free to in the next few minutes. But I wanted to ask one thing in the event that any of the baby boomers needed to go. There's been some comments in the chat pointing to the greatest generation, which would have been the generation preceding you. And they don't get brought up a lot, even though that's a very kind of a pretentious name for them to give themselves, greatest generation. And maybe that's kind of doomed us all, if you think about it. Anyway, I'm wondering, compared to what you've heard from young people now and in your lives, how was your relationship with your elders back then? Did you hear any of the similar complaints? Because just some context, I told some people, our listeners, I'm like, think down the path to how they're going to speak of millennials. We'll be in the baby boomers position one day. Think of the things that they're going to say about us. I got one for you, and I've said this before. They're probably going to talk about how we really messed up crypto. A lot of younger people they're going to talk about millennials with crypto like they talk about boomers with the housing market. Like, why were you so weird with it? Why were you so frivolous? There's no reason for us to treat crypto like the casino we have been, making it into a joke. So I can imagine younger people would make fun of us for that. But I am curious to hear about your feelings about your generation, the greatest generation, or even the silent generation. How does the situation you're hearing from these young people differ from your own? Did you have a different sort of respect for your elders, or any opinions on what they might have gone through?
I mean, my impression is that generational thinking goes in and out of style. I can barely remember before President Kennedy's assassination, but my impression is that talking about generations and so forth was not terribly fashionable. And then 2 months after JFK's assassination, the Beatles land in New York and go on the Ed Sullivan Show. And all of a sudden, for the rest of the 60s, everybody's talking about the generation gap and the struggle between the generations. And then at some point in the 1970s, people stopped talking about it. And you just didn't hear much about generational differences as other kinds of diversity became more seemingly relevant. When did generational talk come back? Maybe 2008, and the economic crisis of that set it off again. So it's this thing that comes in and comes and goes over time. And especially among whites, it's been really big in the last 10 or 15 years. But I could well imagine, that at some point people get bored with it and stop talking about it in the future again. It's really hard to predict fads like this.
Yeah,
Well,
and Herb, to you, the same
I think
question.
that what it partially reflects is how focused a marketing society we have become, and the segmentation of different groups with different interests, and just how as a function of how business is done. So you segment generations and you produce things that they want and you market to them. But the interesting question was how my generation looked at what you referred to as the greatest generation. They didn't consider themselves the greatest generation. They were just people that went to work every day. They were people, second or third or first generation Americans who basically just wanted to get their families going. And I don't think we ever idealized them. I think that the respect that we attribute to them from looking back at them as the greatest generation is seeing what they accomplished and the sacrifices they made and the successes they made. Remember, these were 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who died on the beaches of Normandy to fight the Nazis. They came back and they had families and they worked, they 9 to 5. They were I don't remember exactly what the phrase I'm looking for, but the men in the gray flannel suit, I guess that's what I was looking for. They just went about their business. They didn't have the luxury of wallowing in this extraordinary self-examination that we have now and that our generations have had. I think that's the other thing that needs to be acknowledged, that the extraordinary material wealth that our children and grandchildren have been blessed with, and the elimination of hard times. I mean, the greatest generation went through the Depression. They were kids in the Depression. They saw people who couldn't put food on their table. So, I think they didn't consider themselves the greatest generation, but I think that we, in looking at what they accomplished, did because of what they accomplished. I think, look, there have always been conflicts between generations. That is part of the nature of the human condition. Everything changes, and that's just part of things, the way things evolve. The issues, I think, that underlie a large part of this is the technological speed that's coming. Toffler talked about future shock and how things would change and change more rapidly. And, that's just part of the human existence. That's where we are. A lot of this stuff, I think, is noise. Human beings are still human beings. I'm fascinated by the sense of oppression that our younger men have gotten. And it's something, which I can see, but have a difficult time relating to. But I understand that, and I see it in if you look at the numbers, more women get college degrees, more women get graduate degrees. All the programs are and frankly, it hadn't made them any happier. And so, I'm an old guy, and I look at this stuff and say, maybe all of this change isn't the best thing in the world for everybody, and we got to slow down a little bit and take our time.
That's a great point. So once again, if anyone needed to leave, feel free to. And if you do wish to leave, I would offer you the opportunity for any closing remarks or
I'm
closing.
going to leave. I've enjoyed this a great deal. I thank you all for being here, and I've been watching some of the comments. I find some of them fascinating. I find some of them shocking because I don't spend a lot of time on the social network. And, why is everybody so angry? I don't get it.
So
Anyway.
true, Herb. A great point.
Thanks again, and I appreciate being with all of you, and I appreciate the evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for taking
Have a
the
good
time,
night.
sir.
Have a
great
good
evening.
night.
Take care. Thanks for coming.
All right, so I got some LOLs in the chat. That's a good question. Why are we so angry? I actually do think that might have started with millennials and also maybe Gen X as well, because everyone's complaining there's no love for Gen X. And you're right. There is no love for Gen X, and there won't be. Not here. Not
Yeah,
in
millennials were promised epic bacon, and instead they got like fake meats. that's what it is. I guess we'll even it out a little bit. I also am gonna have to get going here, though. I appreciate the invitation, and I enjoyed the discussion a lot. So thank you for having me, and I'm glad that there were some comments that we're enjoying, and I'm glad too for the haters and losers who were maybe upset by some of the discussion. So.
Let me just say there were not nearly as many haters as I was anticipating for this stream. So that's good.
I think usually I reject the idea of conversation in a political sphere, which is not to say that we don't want political conversation, but I'm sure everyone knows that there's a whole subgenre of political content, which is all about bringing people together and having conversations, which is ultimately about very unimportant subjects. But this is an important conversation because I do have optimism that the younger generation and the older generation of people who sort of understand what's going on can start to see that the generational divide that maybe had defined the relationships between previous generations are not going to be as relevant as we move forward. So I have nothing but respect for boomers. They have a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge, certainly practical knowledge that my generation does not have. And I am always humbled and appreciative of when the respect is extended back to those in my generation who are deserving of it. Sometimes that's not the case, but when it is, I think it is well earned. So thank you again for the invitation. And I'll be listening in as it continues, but I do have to get going.
Great to have you here, John. Thanks again for taking the time. You've been greatly appreciative. Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Have a good night.
You as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Prudentials. I feel like I haven't, you and I are very good friends outside of this, and maybe that has inspired me to throw to you the least. I don't know if you need to have a hard exit as well.
I don't. I was actually going to maybe push back slightly on what Steve had said about this focus on generations maybe coming out of 2008. I recall in the 1980s, there was a television show, called sort of a slice of life family drama called 30-something, which of course, if you were 30-something in the 1980s, you were probably born in the 1950s, that prime later baby boomer years. And I can't help but think to myself that if that's the case, we've kind of always had this focus on generations. And I know that Tom Brokaw is the one that really popularizes the term the greatest generation, but you write for the market and you write because you want someone to call you that. And I feel like the greatest generation didn't mind being called the greatest generation because they wanted to be called that. I mean, if you're part of the thing that emerged out of the Great Depression and wins World War II, you kind of want a title for yourself, as Bob Whitaker might have remarked. But I think we've always, as Americans, been uniquely interested in generations because, especially in the 20th century onward, each generation, I think, isn't so much defined by when the years they were born with, but especially for younger people, and I think Alaric can definitely back me up on this, it's with the technology you grew up with. I see a lot of memes and imagery and graphics being brought up saying, well, you're part of this generation if you were raised on this operating system or with this video game console or with this president. And I think that, despite our focuses on the very real issues of immigration and this coalition, I think that there's this sort of side tangent to it where technology and what you were raised with makes a big part of your generation.
I mean, your mention of the TV show 30-something reminds me of my one reform suggestion that, of course, will never, ever catch on, which is that instead of coming up with these generations that are some number like 16 to 19 years long, but they're not quite the same length, and then different marketing consultants compete to come up with catchy names like, oh, Generation Alpha or something. Why don't we just call people 1940s babies, 1950s babies, 1960s babies by their birth dates, and then we have a 10-year-long decade, and we can see that, yeah, it's arbitrary because obviously it's going to roll over into the next one. But yeah, I can do the arithmetic in my head. If you're a 1980s baby, you're going to be probably in your 40s to late 30s today. Did I get that right? I shouldn't have promised I could do it in my head on the fly. But anyway, that's my suggestion. But of course, we have this giant investment in generational titles that basically only marketing consultants have ever quite memorized.
Well, that's a good point. And we've talked about this on our show, and not to get too esoteric, but this is something Marshall McLuhan talked about. And I know Brood's perking up right now. But we talked about how sort of post-industrial revolution, time took on a different meaning as sort of a container of value, and these sort of demarcations between the generations. We put up walls to allocate, like, this era of time represents a certain amount of value. But one thing you're noticing, especially with younger generations, is that we're starting to shrink that. So like people have mentioned here, a generation is typically 20 years. But when you talk to millennials, you even heard it in this chat. It's like, oh, I'm a high millennial. I'm kind of a zillennial. I go over into the Zoomer side a little bit. So we're already starting to like break these down into smaller and smaller segments of time, probably accelerated by technology. You know, my wife is 5 years younger than me, which is actually a big fucking deal when it comes to technological progress, like social media. Our relationship with social media is actually pretty different. She's a woman, so it's already pretty different anyway. But like me being able to remember 9/11 in a different way than her, I think represents something there. And so we're actually shortening the generations in a sense. What do you guys think about that?
I think the 1946 to 64 baby boom generation that set the template for everything else is too long. We have enough memory of, all the social events that I think if we talk about 1940s babies versus 1950s, I pointed out that there's 4 presidents that were born in the 1940s. We've got a so-called greatest generation individual as president right now, bizarrely enough.
Oh, shit, yeah.
We'll have a 1946 guy is the next president. There were certain advantages that people born in the 40s had that there weren't very many people born in the 30s, so they got good jobs pretty young. And then people born in the 50s and the early 60s were kind of at the tail end of this huge mass of young people. And, there was a lot of competition to move up in the world for them. So, even in things like that, I think talking about 1940s, 50s, 60s kids make more sense, plus the ease of calculation.
Sean Weiland made a good point here. He says the kids these days don't even remember chat roulette. Hey, try Chatterbait, old man. Alaric, what do you think about all this?
I'm actually thinking on a bigger historical scale here. The Industrial Revolution point is definitely notable, but I don't think you really start seeing generations crystallize until post-World War II. Now, you have notions of it before that. It was already on its way to happening. Like the 1920s, for example, had a defining ethos and aesthetic. You can, like today, but even 40 years ago, you could have a 1920s party and people know what that means. There's a definite vision of it via created media products. Namely, nowadays it's like The Great Gatsby. But again, there was a defined vision and feel for a decade.
Yeah, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Evelyn Waugh kind of exploited the notion that they were 20s writers when they started out, and that was very rare before then. So at the elite level, you're having people starting after the Great War to start just defining themselves as a generation, as a cohort, and people generally didn't think about that too much before about 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And my second thought would be that post World War II is when you really see, and I think this is where it crystallizes. You see the marketing invention of the category of teenager.
Right.
You
That's
see,
interesting.
like young person, not quite adult, not quite child existing, rather than child, come of age, adult. Obviously, those categories have been broadening for quite some time, but you really see an explosion of it in the 50s into the 60s, I would say. I might be wrong on this, but that's my feeling.
No, I think that's quite right. I mean, like my late mother-in-law in 1945, when she was 15, put on her bobby socks and went to downtown Chicago to see Frank Sinatra during his the bobby soxer craze, do one of 9 shows in a day. And there's only after that point, you start seeing that kind of thing over and over again. If you go back further in history, it's real hard to find. Like Rudy Valley in 1928 appealed to young women, and they swooned over him. And that's about as far back as we can go to the teen idol singer and so forth. And basically, people didn't think about teenagers much at all as any sort of separate class until basically the marketers got there in the post-war era.
Yeah, I think you can pin it with the Who's "My Generation."
That's interesting.
That's a really cohesive look at the sort of view that didn't exist 20, 30 years before.
Yeah.
Well, you know what's interesting, and Alaric, you might have some thoughts on this, but in our space, especially in the vitalist sphere, there's a lot of talk about youth and the vitality of youth. And I think when people hear youth, because they're raised in the current zeitgeist, they just think teenager. But when youth was spoken of throughout history, go back a few centuries, was the conceptualization of youth different than just teenager as this segmented identity?
Well, I wrote a piece about, like, a very short thing about this recently. The idea of a teenager, the view of it changed really hard, I'd say around the 80s. I might be wrong on that, but that's how I look at it via media, of like a moody and disenfranchised and angry, youth. Meanwhile, you go back to the 19th century or even the early 20th century, and you look at when people are talking about youths. This goes all the way back to ancient times. When they're talking about guys, they're talking about fiery, maybe naive and kind of foolish young men that get into a lot of trouble and really, really want to go to war. Like, that's the defining feature of youth for most of human history. With, like girls, it was wanting to marry as soon as possible. And this is in a lot of the sort of self-reflective Victorian literature, you see mentions of this, but you can find motifs going back all the way to the Greeks. That was sort of the conception of youth as this eternal class that existed and wasn't really, they weren't really positioned opposite their elders. They were just their own thing, and they were a vanguard that kept shifting as, time went on. And they were fiery and really just wanted to experience life or adventure or things like that. And then you start getting this very different view post World War II, where you have teenagers as a defined marketing group, as a defined cultural group with tastes, and then later sort of emotional states that go with it, that then shaped the culture that came out directed at them, and which, that was a reciprocal relationship. They kept shaping each other. And now you have this very historically divorced view of what being young actually is.
Yeah. I mean, for example, Catcher in the Rye in 1950 was one of the first famous characters who was clearly a teenager and was feeling this kind of teen angst. But if you also, when I read it as a teenager in the 70s, I was struck by how Holden Caulfield thinks that that what he wants to do is go hang out in bars with 35-year-olds and basically dress like a 35-year-old and pass for somebody who's older and so forth. And that after the the great teen revolution of, say, the 1960s, that just seemed very alien. So yeah, the modern teenager, definitely emerges after World War II, and it's really quite a different thing than the Western world had ever seen much of before.
And I feel like there's a lot of unfair hatred aimed at marketers in this stream.
Well, I was a marketing researcher, which is like a marketer, but we're not actually really good at coming up with catchy stuff.
Oh no, I work in marketing, and it's
Our
kind
job
of
is to measure it, what the marketers do.
yeah, you're the numbers guys. I'm the guy who goes into a room drunk and says, what if the burger had a vagina? Has that been tried yet? And it turns out it has, but not this big. Now that Herb's gone, we can really have some fun. I was keeping a lot of these horrible sentences to myself because I didn't want to offend his sensibilities. Now you're going to get a double-barreled shotgun of the worst things you've ever heard. We've got a lot of really good comments here. I'll
start talking about Skibbity Toilet. I mean,
you know what? What's funny? Can I just say this? I think people have been unfairly maligning Zoomers because they will look at the Skibbity Toilet meme. To me, it's a bit of a try-hard Reddit-y meme, but whatever. They look at that and say, "Oh, the youth is lost. Look at this. It's just random. It's nonsense." And then if you think back to the stuff millennials were laughing at, it was still just random. Like it was Family Guy. It was, oh, what if the baby was a serial killer and talked British? Like we would kind of invented random humor, but then you think back to, what the fuck was Kids in the Hall and Monty Python and everything too. So I don't think that Skibbity Toilet is as damning as people are treating
Conveniently
it.
sweeping the YouTube poop and random montage sound clips out under the carpet there. I appreciate that, Dimes. There's a whole generation of people who were raised on that.
Look, my generation was raised on Dragon Ball Z clips set to Linkin Park music. And I hate to say it, I still kind of think that's cool. So we don't really have a leg to stand on, millennials. And that I can just hear the Gen X's in the audience cheering, this is me throwing myself under the bus for you burnouts.
Well, just everyone who saw the end of Transformers in 2007 with What I've Done while Shia LaBeouf makes out with Megan Fox on a car. I feel like that kind of defined a generation for some moviegoers. But
that was the meme that defined America for a generation.
It sure did. While the global war on terror was right at its peak, so to speak, that you had that was the kind of thing that you could have. I think the unfair shade thrown at marketers, I think sometimes is totally deserved, just because I work with a lot of marketing people in my own job, and they're very eager to be the guy that coins the next big phrase. But I mean, that's the kind of ambition that you want someone in marketing to have, is to be the one that tells the world to sing and have a Coca-Cola while they're at it, no matter what they're doing. And I think it's good stuff to have.
Well, it is interesting how the teenagers, what they did was they identified that as an economic class. And so, even more nefariously, and we can cop to this, it's technically illegal to market towards children. But have you ever seen a cereal commercial? Of course, they find a way to do it. So kind of targeting immature audiences, and I would say teenagers are an immature audience, targeting them not only for financial exploitation, but also revolutionary exploitation. I mean, that's a deep issue if you want to go there, but saying, once it was believed that the youth would take over the country, now it's being blasted at them by Pepsi and Microsoft. These are my old millennial references, by the way. Can you tell I'm old as shit? Anyway, but they're being told they must be revolutionary. They need to be revolutionary. In fact, that is the only acceptable identity to have. And I think there's an interesting social phenomena where you've created this biomass that is in search for a revolution. I think that overlaps with the Bowling Alone reference we made earlier, which is that these kids, like, they're still looking for unity, they're still looking for some kind of collective, but they're doing it online and they're trying to project that to the rest of the world. They can only think internationally, and I'm not sure I see that changing anytime soon. Would that be sort of the experience of you and Prudentialist and Alaric?
Well, I actually wrote like a piece on this specifically on punk rock, and a lot of Gen Z, you don't have that defined monolithic culture. Like I think millennials might have been the last to have that. Things are a lot more splintered now. But one thing that people do is latch on to the quote unquote like youth generational movements of prior generations and build their identity around that, which is a really odd thing to see. I think it's very emergent with social media. And punk rock is one of those things. Punk rock is like a dead man walking culturally, but it still holds clout among young people because it's defined as this like, oh, this is a young person thing, right? Um, and it's just interesting to see things like that. There's tons of those that you could just, examine. That's just one I happen to have experience with. So the media side of things and the subculture formation is very interesting.
Well, and Mr. Sailor, I think this is a great time to ask you this because you have just been on a book tour promoting your book Noticing, released by Passage Press. And you were speaking about meeting all of the young fans, and you were kind of surprised at the age range of your fans. If you'd like to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I probably shouldn't admit this as an ex-marketing researcher, but I actually don't do any marketing research on my own audience. So I sort of assumed, because I'm 65, that most people who read me are 50 to 80, and over the years, my audience will diminish basically by dropping dead of old age. But then I went on this book tour, and probably the average age was like 32 or something like that. It was showing up for my events. So I guess I've got younger fans. A lot of people attribute it to the Red Scare podcast, which I finally listened to, and that was very amusing. And then I did a podcast with them. But I don't really know. It was a pleasant surprise, but I can't really explain the dynamics of it that well.
Well, you got a lot of young fans watching right now, and I believe Prudentialist Alaric. Like my experience was reading your writing, and some of the older Gen X's, like Jim Goad, would be an example. Being a fan of V Dare and all these places many, many years ago, I think there is a surprising, maybe not surprising, but there is an interest from younger people to read these accounts and appraisals of how America used to be and people who lived through it like yourself, because so much in our generation is speculative. And I think, and I'm not sure if I truly believe this, but let's just say I do for now. I think there's more of an interest in the millennials onward of really scouring through history and seeing the patterns over the past century. Would you say that's true, Prudentialist?
Yeah, I would definitely say so, especially because I think for a lot of people our age and younger, there has been this desire to look more inwardly. I think some of that's brought on by, not to throw marketers under the bus, but there has been this trend to be introspective or to think that you're part of your greater self or anything like that. And you see this especially with nonprofits and charities, like I mentioned earlier, trying to bring people in and make them feel like they're a good person, because there has been this sort of commoditization of misery or just greater commiseration of people fetishizing their own sadness and so on. And so anyone who tries to find an escape looking towards what did the past have, you see this on the right, where there's sort of this nostalgia for a time that they can't ever belong to, or understanding what were the great men of the past like. And I mean, Alaric has done a really good job at this. He had recently republished with the Dissident Review, My Confession by Samuel Chamberlain, which is one of the greatest recollections and memoirs of the Mexican-American War, and it was also the inspiration for Blood Meridian. And it's a fantastic read, and no one knows about its existence nowadays, despite the fact it inspired one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. And so I think that what you're seeing people do a lot now, like you had mentioned there, Dimes, is that people are looking towards previous writers and seeing how they are. I know a lot of Canadians like to read George Grant to sort of see how on earth how did Canada get to where we are today. And I first found Steve Saylor when he was replying to some of the articles and arguments that were put out by Freakonomics with respects to abortion and so on. That's the first time I heard you. And unfortunately, that now that article just says authors. They've kind of redacted you from history, unfortunately. But you're still around, thank God.
Yeah. No, not yeah. That's yeah. It was. I debated Stephen Levitt, the University of Chicago economist, and Slate in 1999, and they kept our debate up there, but they took our names off it, and now it just says by authors.
Yeah, Steve, do you know that you're kind of a everybody younger around my age might not know who you are, but your work is very prevalent. It's very well known. I mean, before I knew who you were, I had read screenshots and extracts on like Instagram and 4chan and iFunny and stuff like that. You're on TikTok.
Okay.
You'll
Well,
see
also
like
because you
videos. Yeah.
understand how to use Twitter, whereas a lot of us in this space would probably have also maybe come of age around Jared Taylor, guys like that. Maybe if you're a bit more on the further right, it might be someone like David Duke or someone. But Jared Taylor, he had a moment where he was really in the mainstream talking about a lot of these issues, but he might not really want to.
He got thrown off Twitter about 7 to 9 years ago, and he still hasn't been let back on. I talked to him about it a month ago at dinner, and yeah, he'd be really good on Twitter, and it's ridiculous the people who are allowed on Twitter and not a fine gentleman like Jared.
Yeah, I wonder if we can pressure them. Someone can to get Jared Taylor on. He's probably like if I had to elect someone to go on like Joe Rogan right now, it would be Jared Taylor.
Easily.
He's not as much of a psycho schizo as some other people I know. Times, even though we've got some great representatives of the young people here. As we've seen over the past 30 minutes, I really start to burn out into nonsense if you just kind of let me going. Just reading the chat right here. By the way, not to alarm anyone, there has been a confirmed woman in the chat. I've been seeing a lot of people overreacting to that. I've been seeing a lot of people talking DMs. I want everyone to chill. I've lit a couple candles. Everyone's it's a vibe in here now. Leave her alone. We don't need to scare her off. We don't get a lot of women in these chats, and anytime you hear about one, she gets her limbs ripped off practically. No, here goes Mystic Cheese saying, "Where's she at?" I'm going to tell you. Get back to Odyssey. Get back to the
14
trenches.
_Mystic_Cheese_88 with the triple X. It's
Yeah.
just that's
like
a masterpiece of a username.
It's a 2007 Xbox Live gamer tag. He probably would have called me a slur on Xbox Live in a Modern Warfare 2 lobby, 15 years ago. So it's good to see that tradition's still alive. But I think, maybe to get back on topic real quick, it's just that I think one of the bigger things there has been is that there has been this trained animosity towards the baby boomers. And to some extent, I would say, when you have hindsight is 2020 or you're sold a political narrative or formula about where things all went wrong. And again, everyone's got their own form of political eschatology and historiography. That, especially after, say, the financial crisis in 2008, people, like you said, Dimes, they're going to yell at people who are mishandling the housing market or so on, in the same way that people will probably blame us for ruining crypto. And I wonder, how much of that can we fairly put on towards the baby boomers? Because I feel as if people will accept intergenerational conflict and hatred very easily without perhaps doing the reading or research themselves. I mean, a lot of people do like to blame the baby boomers, but how much of the structural changes that transformed America were instituted by people who were older than the baby boomers? Let's not forget the generations of them born in the 1940s, 50s, and very early 60s, followed by, the changes that came were instituted by those born prior to them. The Supreme Court justices that were ruling on all sorts of things, such as like Wickard v. Filburn or other cases that have sort of laid down the framework for our America's sort of, lack of a better term, sort of like race communism, as some like to call it, were all instituted by people older than them. And I mean, there were multiple political generations of baby boomers, whether it be like Sam Francis or Bob Whitaker, or others who worked in the so-called New Right or the Reagan Revolution. Some of them were boomers, some of them were older. I think that it's very easy to just slap a label on a generation or a group of people, and then to hand wave the nuance or anything like that. And it makes it very easy for us to just shoot at each other across the generational trench lines and not figure out the root cause of some of these problems.
Yeah, and this is where I come from on the whole issue, which is that we have so many other enemies, opponents, maybe even oppressors, that it seems, not to get conspiratorial, if there was some kind of psyop, a highly effective one would be to turn people of a similar ethno-religious background, or even people within their own families, against each other, seeing each other as the primary enemy. Young men seeing their own grandparents, their own great grandparents as the primary drivers of their oppression. And it just seems like a failed opportunity. It seems like energy displaced into a place it shouldn't be. And I think we do all the other good work we could do a disservice if we don't try and resolve that and concentrate, as we've discussed in this stream, in other areas. And once again, that's the reason I wanted to broker this discussion. And I think that's why, someone like Steve or someone like Herb is so important, because they represent similar, but as we've seen, somewhat different ideas of what America is capable of. And these are just two representations of the people you will meet when you go out and engage in these conversations with them. And I think you should. I would hate for people to hear this conversation and think that it's a lost cause, and that that it's not worth doing, because I actually do think it's probably the only thing worth doing. And I do think it needs to be done on a one-to-one level. And that's kind of why I was pushing the civic groups and the in real life socialization, because boomers, they don't like really coming on live streams that much. We got lucky tonight, but a lot of them just don't like social media that much, especially post-COVID, where everyone wants a Zoom meeting and now no one wants a Zoom meeting. So you almost have to meet them where they are. That's my opinion. Sorry, Steve, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah. I mean, I would just in turn say that, that people my age have to be made aware that complaining about kids these days, since that kind of thing, is just a stereotype that you're cranky and old, and try to be sympathetic to your own children and grandchildren. They've got issues you didn't have to deal with, and we can help each other out. We don't have to put each other down constantly.
Oh, we got one paid chat here. Is Steve coming to the Old Glory Club conference from Bolero 390?
I wish, but perhaps next time.
I don't know.
We would love to have Steve come and have you speak at one of these. So we'll talk sometime later. We'd love to have that happen today.
All right. Now that essentially wraps up all the talking points that I had. Believe we covered most of the super chats. Let me just check on Odyssey. I think I missed a couple here. We had Milk Trucker saying very interesting. Thank you. I don't have the Odyssey chats piped in here like I do the YouTube chat, so I'm just reading them off right now. We have one here from Darby, who spent $25. I just really wanted to read this. He had said, fantastic conversation. I'm not sure we need the government to back off. What we need is for government or local organizations to be staffed by people with our values and mercilessly drive out the libtards. Clear them out. That's pretty much what the other side has been doing for 60 years. Thank you very much for that, Darby. I believe that covers the super chats on Odyssey right now. I guess any thoughts on that, Darby, saying the clear them out theory of politics? What do you think about that?
Clear them out.
Well, I mean, you're seeing school boards, local citizens kind of reclaiming their local public schools in a bunch of different parts of the country, and good for them.
And this is essentially the Project 2025 that people have been talking about, which is irrespective of whatever happens to Trump going forward, is a plan to not just elect, but staff the organs of power and the entire Republican Party and that whole political apparatus with quote unquote our guys, which would mean, the craziest guys that we know, instead of trying to vote them in, try to basically take over the managerial elite is one way of looking at it. And there's a whole Christ, I don't know, 1,000-page PDF outlining that, and a few articles written about it. But that seems to be an interesting opportunity. You know, I'm not terribly optimistic on democracy, but it struck me as something interesting, which is a bit more of a cynical power play that I think could work. I would like to see that. You know, Prudentialist, what do you think about that? I know you've read quite a bit about this stuff.
Yeah, I've read bits and pieces of that 1,000-some-odd-page Project 2025 thing. I mean, it just seems to be. I know in, say, the United Kingdom's politics, you have a lot of these sort of conservative or Labour Party manifestos saying this is what we're going to do if elected, and that's what this feels like. Is if a Republican administration gets in, this is what these heritage think tank guys have said. This is what we're going to do. Some of it's good, some of it definitely does not could read the room, so to speak. But I think that the idea of clearing them out or making things more institutionally viable for younger men of competence to definitely come on board would be great. As someone who works in local government, I know that I am the youngest person at my office by about 30 years. And so it's certainly a big divide where people who are totally unaware that their problems have names and addresses, and I mean that in a non-Fed posty kind of way. I mean that you literally could go to these people and try and get your issues resolved, whether it be about your roads or whatever. People just don't realize that exists because I think we're so comfortable focusing on these meta narratives or the grand scheme of things on Washington and politics writ large. And I think that when people say, "Oh, localism," I think that always gets misinterpreted for go build a farm or a homestead somewhere. Not to say that that's not an option for you, but you know, a lot of your options locally do have avenues for political resolution. But there was a question for Steve. I noticed it was because I'm also restreaming this for you, Dimes. And Mona asks the question. He says, I'm sorry for the tangent. He sends $5. He says, but Mr. Saylor, he says, do you have an opinion of Michael Jackson? Do you think of him as a superstar? Do you think of the attacks about him being a racial or a sexual abuser true? Or totally random question, but people are curious on your thoughts.
He was an amazing talent. I suppose the scandals were true. It's distasteful, and I haven't looked into them. But yeah, I mean, I can remember "I Want You Back" in 54 years ago, coming on the radio, on the AM radio, and oh, that's an exciting new band. They're probably going places. So yeah.
We're talking about Michael Jackson, huh? So I think the entire issue was buttoned up by the great Cat Williams during his bid when he had said, I like bitches. So in my house, I have things that bitches like. Now, if I have an amusement park in my house, and really, you start to say, "Oh yeah, why does this grown man have so many water slides and teddy bears and childlike things?" You know what I mean? I think that's a fair take to have on that. What do you think, Prudentialist? What do you think about Michael Jackson?
For someone who kind of grew up as a kid hearing all the rumors of him being an abuser or someone who was a little too friendly with kids, I think that a lot of people who are brought into stardom when they're very young children are oftentimes incredibly traumatized and or abused. And so I think that this was someone who had a lot of arrested development kind of issues. Yeah. And I think that probably played a much larger role. I mean, this was a man who deeply wanted his privacy. So, I mean, when all these sort of scandals brought out in court, I mean, you know, if you're talking about wanting to expose photos of him to the world, you know, nude medical analysis of Michael Jackson, I mean, he would do anything to keep that private. So I think that certainly he would want to be keeping that, you know, private. So I think, you know, he's probably much more misaligned and slandered than anything. And I kind of take the razor fist perspective that he's probably more innocent than he is guilty.
I mean, yeah, I'm not a big fan of making children into stars at incredibly early ages. I wouldn't mind. Something I think what's been going on is that we used to have a lot of baby chimpanzees used in entertainment, like Bedtime for Bonzo with Ronald Reagan, which is a pretty interesting movie, by the way. But now Yeah, we don't do that as much. It's considered kind of not a good thing to capture baby chimps in Africa and then bring them to America, and then when they turn 8, they're not cute anymore. They're ugly and scary, and they live another 50 years. It's just a disaster. So, how do they make entertainment? Well, they do a lot of CGI these days. Maybe in the future we could stop using really young child actors and stop making them into stars and just have CGI the way Bart Simpson is voiced by a middle-aged lady. I think that might be healthier for child talents like that. Let them grow up kind of normal out of the spotlight.
Well, Alaric, what do you think about Michael Jackson? Apparently, my take was the unpopular take.
I don't know. I've never dug into Michael Jackson to any significant degree. I mean, he's got a couple of good songs. Besides that, very strange figure. That's the most I can glean from it, just because I haven't really dug into it. Just a strange guy, for sure.
Yeah, I got one for you. Why would a good guy record a song like Bad? He says it all in black and white right there, guys. I mean, what the fuck?
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, well, don't act surprised. I've had a lot of bangers on this that I feel have been underappreciated, frankly, because I got a lot of disinformation agents in the chat, including this cheese guy, who's one of my greatest friends, by the way, but he's been plotting for my downfall this entire time. He acts like I don't see it, like I'm not laser focused on the chat right now. Here we go, Jacob.
Chat, and there have been some pretty funny things in there from just good jokes to just wild misunderstandings of the words people are using.
Oh, look, good point, Eric. He's a smooth criminal. I mean, these guys, they like to sign their work. All right. We've been going for over 2 hours now. I think I need to head out soon. And I wanted to just wrap up this stream. I've had a phenomenal time. And I'm wondering if anyone who's remaining would like to just plug anything that they've got going on here or any closing remarks on the issue. We've kind of had closing remarks over the past little while, but including myself. But if you have any plugs or any closing thoughts.
Well, I'll plug my book, Noticing. It's an anthology of my best stuff going back the last 30 years. You can get it on Amazon, paperback or Kindle. You can get it directly from Passage Publishing. Just look them up. $29.95. So it's selling really well, and it's been a pleasure being able to go on discussions like this and go, hey, buy my book, Noticing.
Yeah. It's great to see a book like that selling so well in a publishing environment that we've always understood to be pretty hostile to people of our political persuasion. I honestly think a lot of people had written it off entirely until you had the likes of Antelope Hill, Imperium Press, which is one of my favorites as well, and also Passage Press, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So a Prudentialist and Alaric, hit me with the digits.
Oh, sure. Once again, thank you so much, Dimes, for having me on. This was a great opportunity to talk to you, Mr. Sailor. It was a great pleasure, great honor. For me, I would just simply say that you can find me on YouTube and Twitter and Substack, theprudentialist.substack.com. I'm going to have an article about Jeremy Carl's book, The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. That should be out in the coming days. And again, I would also echo Mr. Sailor's call to buy book, as Mystery Grove would say. Go ahead and go buy Noticing from Passage Press. It's a great book. I've got it myself. It's some of the greatest hits of Mr. Sailor. Well worth reading.
Yeah, I will second that. Absolutely support Noticing. It's a fantastic collection of work. I've only read so far. I'll admit I have not read the whole thing, but I want to fully get a straight read through. But that aside, this has been a great conversation. I think a boomer zoomer rapprochement is a good thing overall. There's a lot of undue anger directed at the young or the old on both sides, and I think we're a lot a lot better if we're, you know, working towards a common goal. With that said, on my side, you can follow the Dissident Review on Twitter. Check out the website. There's actually a new article on there as of yesterday. I think worth reading on Irish history. A couple of books available now, and a bunch available on Amazon. You can also follow me on Twitter. And yeah, thank you, Dimes, for having me on. This has been an absolutely excellent conversation.
And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to watch tonight. It's been I've been greatly lightened. It's very late. I don't know what I'm saying. I've been heartened. Even worse word. Anyway, I'm loving the chat. Loving the positive feedback. We were not brigaded like I thought we would. And for myself, host of Blood Satellite, check out bloodsatellite.ca. I'm also editor of the Vanguardist Journal. Check that out, vanguardistjournal.com. I'm not going to spend too much time plugging myself because you've spent enough time listening to me. So I just want to say thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Had a fantastic time. Hope you did as well. And I'll see you next time.